According to data from a Harvard-trained economist, it looks like Putin's economy might actually be in danger of imminent collapse. How exactly did old Vladdy Daddy cook his own economy trying to beat the Ukrainians? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Plus, how much longer can Russia really keep this up? Anyway, this is a really interesting op-ed that initially appeared in Fortune as it's actually three very, very credentialed economists here. When you look up their background, these guys are senior advisors to countries. In the case of Jeffrey Sonfield, he was literally got his PhD in Harvard and now teaches at the Yale School of Management. So this is not like amateur hour here. And this is a sprawling, really, to call it an op-ed is pretty light. This is a absolutely sprawling, I guess you could call it like not quite an academic paper, but pretty close to it, right? Around several thousand words, in which they describe how the Russian economy has a lot of warning indicators flashing pretty loudly right now. And they acknowledge that the Russia's public face has said that its economy is actually humming along pretty well. It reports to have a healthy 9% inflation rate. You might recall, if you're in my US audience, that a 9% inflation rate sucks if you're a consumer, right? And that the average Russian is experiencing a way higher rate of inflation. They actually think that it's closer to 27% in terms of the real inflation rate. And that Russia, who planned on using a literal war chest of foreign reserves that it's accumulated over 20 years, that it's actually going to burn through those. About half of that war chest has actually been seized and is sitting in Western accounts where the interest it's accruing is actually being donated to Ukraine. And then Putin thinks that it still has a lot of money in the Chinese central bank, but it's not clear that China would be willing to let that go, certainly not on the cheap. And to make things even worse, the oil and gas sector is something that Russia claims is thriving, right? It says, oh, revenues have never been higher. But again, if you think the actual inflation rate is closer to 24%, then what you have is actually a situation where increasing taxes on things like liquid natural gas producers and Gazprom are not actually increasing revenues, right? Because here's the thing to think about, and they make an interesting point. You know, Russia says, hey, we're spending more rubles next year on our defense. We're increasing our defense budget. But will those increased rubles actually buy more things? Again, these economists say, no, it's a trick, because just like saying, hey, we've never spent more on groceries, right? But is that true? Are you getting more groceries for what you're spending? No, you say, oh, our grocery budget's never been higher. But if you still buy the same bread, the same meat, the same cheese, the same milk, then you're not actually getting more. And they argue that that's what Russia's basically in their entire war economy is doing. And the problem is, unlike you in the grocery store, right? There's no amount you could spend at the grocery store to drive up the entire price of milk, right? You couldn't do it. Even if you went in and spent your whole grocery budget on milk, you still probably wouldn't even clear out all the milk in the stores. But if you're a government, the economists argue, that's absolutely what you can do. They call it cannibalizing, right? They cannibalize productive assets in order to fund the war machine. And these productive assets take a whole bunch of forms, right? For example, a lot of payments and investments that would otherwise be spent driving Russia's economy are actually social welfare payments, right? These are payments to the families of dead and wounded soldiers. These are pensioners. And military payments alone represent about 4% of all consumer spending by Russians. That's pretty scary. Imagine if you had so many dead and wounded that 1 in every $25 spent in your economy was done by wounded soldiers and their families. It would be, again, a sign of a broken economy that's spending way more than it's actually making, right? And you could see it, right? 60% of Russian physicians say that their salaries are insufficient to meet basic needs. Let that sink in. Again, Russian doctors, highly trained doctors, say we don't make enough to buy the basics: rent, heat, water, food. 80% of physicians work multiple jobs to make ends meet. So again, if you aren't one of these soldiers, you see that the salaries they're making are probably high, but they're not as high as the real inflation rate, the things that Russians actually need to function day to day. Of course, they also talk about the fact that Russia's having a massive brain drain. Because when Putin announced his first wave of mobilization, basically every Russian who could scrounge together $3,000 got on a flight out of the country, and they haven't come back. So again, physicians, where their salaries, again, should be at an all-time high because there's so few remaining in Russia that they still can't meet their basic needs. So this is all the data they talk about. IT workers have had their salaries in real terms decreased by 25%. Again, that's in part because of an exodus of multinational companies. And it's also because, again, while their salaries rise, they're not rising as fast as inflation, meaning functionally, they are, the number on their paycheck is greater, but it buys them less things in the Russian economy. Again, when we look and we ask, okay, well, this is just an op-ed, right? Maybe they're just not really, maybe things are fine. But let's look at the chart here. This is the 5-year chart, by the way, guys. Let's see if we can make this just a little bit bigger so we can really see it. Okay, here we go. Right, so we look at the 5-year chart. Now you can see that in the initial outset of the invasion and the initial outset of Western sanctions against Russia, the ruble, you couldn't give away a ruble. This is how many rubles it takes to buy $1, right? You couldn't give away the ruble. And then the Russian central bank really fought tirelessly and stabilized it. In fact, the ruble was never more valuable against the US dollar than in June of 2024. You can see what's happened over the last 2 years is that the ruble was rising in price. And then again, in October, it seems like the Russian central bank managed to stabilize it. But now there's a third surge, and it's moving faster than we've almost ever seen, short of the actual sanctions themselves. And this is now seeing the ruble climb from 84 rubles buys you a buck to 97 rubles buys you a buck. And I think it's pretty clear. There's actually some rumors that Putin has said he doesn't want the ruble to exceed 100, but there's limits to how possible these sort of things are. And that's one of the real problems. And you can see that, again, prior to the invasion, right, 2021, you're looking at about 74 was about the healthy exchange rate of rubles to dollars. Now, again, prior to COVID in 2019, you're looking at about 63, 64. So in those 4 years, you can see that you're talking about a 30 to 35% increase. Again, when you look at things over the last year, you can see that they defended the ruble against the dollar and other currencies, right? Defending it all the way down to 84. And now it's just not clear that they can continue to. And when I say defend it, what happens is a lot of times in these countries, their central bank will actually buy or sell currencies. They'll sell rubles and buy yuan or euros in order to sort of prop up their currency. And Russia has to play additional games to make this happen. Now, we're going to talk about what the other thing that Russia needs to sustain its economy, oil, and how, man, they are in trouble in the oil department too. But before I do that, of course, if you want to support this channel, keep me independent. I don't take money from governments. I don't take money from shady Russian media companies. Instead, I rely on you guys, the audience, to support me. And you can do that over on combatvetnews.com. This is my site. It's my version of Patreon, where we have a whole bunch of different tiers that get you access to twice weekly, uncensored combat footage straight from the front lines. Sometimes it's as little as a day old, and it's uncensored GoPros, drone footage. It gives us insight we can't get anywhere else. But if you really appreciate it, you can get access to the weekly Q&As, the shout outs, even the by name recognition recognition depending on your tier. So the link is in the description. Check it out, combatfitnews.com. Keep me independent. I appreciate you guys. Okay, so another economist from Johns Hopkins has, again, said that the real inflation rate is about 27% and the ruble is just indefensible, right? So we're looking at a growing consensus among economists that the ruble is really in trouble. But don't worry, Putin says, we have our secret weapon, Gazprom, right? The ability of Russian state-owned or state-affiliated companies who are heavily taxed can still pull out crude oil from the ground and sell it. And for much of this conflict, that's been true because Putin is a brilliant strategist. Like, don't kid yourself. The man knows what's up. And he knew that when he invaded Ukraine, it would cause a spike in gas prices because nobody really knew what was going to happen to the price of a barrel of oil. It meant that as long as Putin could continue to sell oil, that he would be able to make a lot of money. And you could see that that's exactly what happened, right? He invades Ukraine and it was climbing and then suddenly it spikes. $115 a barrel, $118 a barrel. And then slowly things start to look a little better, right? We realize that oil and gas production is not actually going to decrease, but thanks to the price cap, oil's become pretty plentiful and pretty cheap, right? Down to $75, $80, $90 a barrel, right? The global price. And you can literally see this looks a lot like the ruble chart, doesn't it? Right? And it's not an accident. It's because the number one thing that Russia does with rubles, number one thing that the global economy does with rubles is buy Russian oil. And so you have this problem. And that is what's happened over the last, we're going to say, 3 months or so. You could see that the weekly oil price was at 81 in July, $81 a barrel, right? October 11th, it was down to 74. But now it's even worse. It's $69 a barrel. So it's nearly a 9% drop from literally just 5 days ago. This is a huge problem. And you can see right here. Look, October 14th, boom, gets crushed once and now has been on a steady decline. So that means if you're Russia, you have a huge problem on your hands. You can't sell oil for more than $60 a barrel. And initially, that meant that there was a real discount to be had, right? And they could still sell oil to Europe, which is insane to me. But Europe has its inflationary crisis, and who are we to argue against it, I guess, right? If only the Europeans hadn't shut down all their nuclear power plants, but that's neither here nor there. But you could see that things are looking a little problematic for oil prices. A lot of these European economies in the US, we've licked inflation. We say we don't need to keep oil cheap. And remember, if you have the closer it gets to the oil price cap, countries have this decision. They say, listen, I can run up against US sanctions, or I could pay and buy Russian oil, or I can just buy oil from literally anyone else, from the Saudis, from the Venezuelans, from the US. I could buy oil from whoever I want. And so as you reduce the price, Russian oil looks less and less appealing, which means that Gazprom's revenues, which already are at all-time lows, they actually ran a loss last year, they're going to run an even bigger loss, right? And again, when you're running a loss, what happens? And and the Ukrainians, they keep bombing Russian oil facilities. And it's going to get harder and harder and more expensive to repair those facilities again and again and again. And all of this is adding to the situation that is cooking the Russian economy. You could see the U.S.'s ally, Saudi Arabia, has finally come out and said, listen, we are going to ramp up crude production because we want to undercut Russia's revenues. Right? This is according to Politico. Riyadh saying, listen, we used to say, hey, we want to try to keep oil at $100 a barrel, but we can't compete with Russia, who's, again, selling it at 60. And so they said, you know what? We want to make sure that we are the global winner in oil, and we're going to do a favor to our friends, the United States, and we are going to start to pump out oil like it's going out of style. And so sure enough, right? If oil prices fall $20 from or $20 from their October 1st prices, Russia would lose $20 billion in revenue, 1% of the country's GDP. For the record, guys, they spend about 6% of their GDP on military affairs. So that would take out 1 of 6% of Russia's war economy. And that's just a $20 fall in prices. Bear in mind, guys, we've seen, something akin to that already. So if it's right now about 69, so it was 89. Let's see. It was about in April. Maybe let's see if we can get the 1 year chart here. Yeah. So basically it dropped. If it drops down from 86 down to 60 or 86 down to 66, that is going to punish the Russian economy. And it's going to make things even worse because, again, if no one wants rubles to buy Russian oil, that means that your rubles are going to become even less valuable. And Russians are going to have to spend more of their hard-earned rubles just to buy food. And if there's one thing we know, it's that if you want, people will tolerate a lot of autocratic mismanagement in their country. But once they can't feed their kids, all bets are off. Anyway, guys, hit that subscribe button. Thanks to our Colonel tier members like Bill Collier, Robert Colburn, Gaius Marning, Gina Cuesta, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Karius, AL90, and Pecha Tororu, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you all so much, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.